Thanks, Sharita. Welcome back, everybody. Today is our office hours session, so we are going to start with going over the exercise and going over answers with the exercise. And then if you have any questions in general that came about from Subpart L yesterday, please go ahead into the Q&A box, like Sharita said, and type those questions, and Les and I will answer those. We also have HUD staff with us today, too, that can help us if we get into a jam and need a little further explanation. They're always really good at helping us pick apart and providing the best answers that we can. So that's kind of our format. We didn't have a lot of questions that came in yesterday. Usually we go through the questions that came in the day before and kind of highlight some of those, but you were a pretty quiet group, really paying attention to what we were talking about. But hopefully we'll get some good questions coming in today. So let's start with our exercise. There we go. All right, so if you recall yesterday, when we go over these different handouts, I'm going to be scrolling down. And when I scroll down on my page, you're not going to see that. So you need to take your own cursor and put it to the right side of the document in between the participant panel and the document. And there's a gray bar that shows up, and you can scroll down so that you can see the rest of the exercise. So as I do that, your screen does not change, so you need to make sure you're moving things down to be able to see what I see as well. All right, so hopefully you had a chance to look at some of these questions and come up with some answers. If not, hopefully you'll just learn a little more today. So let's get started. We're going to start off with how do HUD lead-based paint regulations work in tandem with the CDC and EPA? And can you give one or more examples? Well, I like to go to slide 18. And so the first example I'm going to have here is that HUD is using the confirmed blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter, while the CDC has lowered the reference level to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. So HUD is going to continue to follow the 5 micrograms per deciliter at this time, but you know, they are always checking with the CDC. So we have that. I'm going to go to slide 45. Oops, that's not the right slide. I'm sorry, 23. There we go. This is another one where we're working in tandem with another regulation. So we have HUD's regulations found at 24 CFR Part 35, and then we have EPA's that are found at 40 CFR Part 745. So we have our lead disclosure rule. Remember, that's identical to Subpart A, that's for the lead regulations. We have our D, L, and Q, our lead-based paint activities rule. And then we have our renovation, repair, and painting rule. And so these all apply to housing and child-occupied facilities such as schools and daycares built before 1978. Those are a couple examples there. Let's go back to our exercise. All right, question number 2. What projects or units must comply with the Lead Safe Housing Rule and are subject to federal, EPA, or HUD enforcement actions regarding lead-based paint? So this is our HUD-assisted housing that's built before 1978, unless there's some exceptions. We also have ongoing maintenance, and so we need to make sure we're following all of our ongoing maintenance requirements. We have lead specialists. These are also, our risk assessor, our lead inspector. We might need to have them also do clearance if the area is larger than de minimis. So those are all some other areas that we need to ensure we're following. All right. Let's look at number 3. What type of vendors or contractors and their qualifications that a PHA or an owner should have on call? Well, first we want to have staff that can do visual assessment, because we're going to be looking during that ongoing maintenance period, we're going to be looking to ensure that the unit still does not have any deteriorated paint. If before that, if we found that we didn't have any records to do to show that we had lead work done, we would need to do a lead inspection and a risk assessment. And so we would need to hire a risk assessor to do that part. Here's our summary chart, so this can help us a little bit more. If we identified during that risk assessment, if we identified work that needed to happen, we would be doing abatement if we had modernization funds. If not, we were doing interim controls. And so for our abatement, we need to have our abatement supervisors, our abatement workers. For interim controls, we have someone who's trained in RRP to do that work. We would need to be having clearance done. If we had abatement done, then we need to have a risk assessor or a lead inspector do that clearance. If we had a lesser type of reduction done, we could have a clearance technician do the clearance. Let's see. Okay. And then just to show you too, we have this handout of who can perform what kind of work. And so remember here we're doing either interim controls or abatement. And so you're able to see for interim controls, it's our RRP, people trained in RRP. If we're doing abatement, we have our abatement workers, we have our abatement contractor supervisors, that can do that work for us here too. And then the second page of this document shows you where they can get the training and what regulations that follows. All right, let's look at number 4. What are the key steps and the documents that the PHA needs to follow in order to ensure that the units are in compliance? So that's, again, I'd like to start with our summary chart here. We're doing disclosure. So remember, we're disclosing, we're providing that disclosure notice either before lease signing or at lease signing. We're also providing the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home pamphlet. And we're providing tenant instructions. So we're letting the tenant know who to notify if they identify any deteriorated paint. We are looking, so in this case, we are assuming that the risk assessments and lead inspections were all done several years ago, and so now we're just doing visual assessments to ensure, and we have documentation of that, so we're doing visual assessments to ensure there's no deteriorated paint. We're treating if we find any deteriorated paint using interim controls. If the area is larger than de minimis, we're having someone trained, we are always having someone trained in RRP, but we're providing the RRP pamphlet. If for some reason we need to relocate the household, we're making sure that we're doing occupant protection. We might have to be involved with temporary relocation. We're going to be doing clearance and having our risk assessors do our clearance. We're going to provide a copy of the notice of lead hazard reduction activities that would include the information from the clearance report in there, and then we'll be going into ongoing maintenance. All right, let's look at number 5. How do you know if your organization is ready to meet compliance? Well, hopefully none of this stuff is new to you. You know where in the files the lead inspection and risk assessments are being stored and where the lead documentation is, so that if you need to go back and see where the lead is in the unit, that's possible. If it's not, then you need to start to do risk assessments of your units, because you have to have that information available. We have to know where it is. We had a discussion with HUD before the session talking about there's been a lot of retirements going on. We have the whole baby boom generation retiring, and the person that kept track of this information might have retired. We might not know where this is, and so we're going to have to do risk assessments again, because we have to have that information on file. You should have a list of certified workers, either whether they're on staff or are you contracting out to have work done. You should have policies and procedures about what to do if you have an elevated blood level child, as well as what are you doing for ongoing maintenance. How is that going to be documented? who's doing the work, what's the schedule for that. So those are just some things that you would want to have to know that you're ready, and hopefully you have some of these and you just need to brush them up a little bit, or you might be starting from scratch, and if that's the case, now at least you have a good roadmap of what you need to do. Okay. All right, I'm going to move down to the scenario, and so our scenario is prior to move-in inspection. So we have a unit is turning over in the city's public housing agency, and the property was built in 1960, and the housing agency confirmed that there are records, so they do have records of the lead-based paint inspection and the risk assessments of all the units on file from 2002, and now it's 2022, so we're 20 years later, and records show that abatement was conducted, but there's no record that the units are lead-free. So the type of abatement might have been some type of enclosure or encapsulation. So it wasn't removed from the units. It's still, the lead is still there, but it is safe. It's a lead safe unit. It's not lead free. So what steps must be completed before a new family can move in? So let's look at our slides. I'm going to go to slide 47, I think. Yep. Okay. So if you remember, Les had used this to try to figure out for you, where do you start? Well, for our scenario, we're going to be looking at the second arrow here. So they have a lead inspection and a risk assessment on file. Lead abatement was conducted, but the unit was not certified as lead-free, so we're going to be doing a visual assessment at unit turnover. So our staff has been trained as visual assessors. They took the free online HUD visual assessment training. I have documentation in my files that they're visual assessors, so they're doing the inspection. If the unit passes inspection right away, then that new family can move in right away. If my staff is going through and they've identified deteriorated paint, then we need to be doing interim controls on that deteriorated paint. And the people that are doing that work have been trained in RRP. And so we're doing that work. If that work area or if the work in the unit is larger than de minimis, then we need to have clearance done on that work. And then we would get a notice of lead hazard reduction activities. That would be part, including the clearance results, and we would put that in the file. And then the unit has passed clearance now, so that new family can move in, but before the new family moves in, I need to provide a disclosure notice. So I'm giving a disclosure notice to that family before they move in, and they're going to sign the disclosure notice. I'm disclosing I'm disclosing the records that we have. I'm disclosing that we just did some additional work, that it passed clearance, so they have all that information. And then they move in. But for me, I need to continue on with my ongoing maintenance. So remember, we talked about ongoing maintenance. We get to that slide, 87. So, you know, we're in year 22, so we're like way down here. So we're continuing to do visual assessments. Hopefully, you know, our units are continuing to be in fairly good shape. If for some reason, you know, we're starting to find a lot more of deterioration, it could be a best practice that we do another risk assessment. It's not required, but we might do a best practice to determine where these additional hazards might be. Also, we had some discussion earlier before folks got on about some of these components that had lead in them are starting to be replaced over the years. Perhaps there were wooden shelves that had lead paint in them, and then over the years we've been replacing those shelves with wire shelves so that those components are no longer there in the unit. So that, you know, that happens as the years go on, as we're doing maintenance with our projects, and so perhaps doing another lead inspection might be a best practice to determine where is the lead now still in that unit. Do we even still have lead in that unit? So 20 years later, that might be something you want to think about, not required though. Like I said, we were going to have certifications of the staff, or if we had to hire a contractor that did the RRP work, I would have that in my file. I'm going to be keeping all of my records, and as I have questions, I'm going to be going to these different resources. I'm going to be looking at my chart. I'm going to go to the toolkit, see if there's any new forms that I might want to implement into my program, and I can always go to the lead regulations email, which I think is at the very end. I'm trying to see how far we can go here. I didn't write it down.
It's on one of the last.
Yeah, what's the number? I'm trying to type in, and it's like, we don't have that many slides. It's like
107.
107. Yeah, thank you. It's telling me there's not 110 pages in this document. Yes, so down here, you know, if you've exhausted all your reference areas, you can't find what you're looking for, don't drive yourself crazy. Send an email to leadregulations@hud.gov, and they'll be happy to help you out and answer questions. But Les and I and the HUD staff are here for another 40 minutes, so we would love to hear what your questions are or see what your questions are and help provide any answers. So Les, any questions that came in or anything else you want to expand upon for the scenarios?
We don't have any questions at the moment that have come in. I was going to mention on number 5 on our exercise about making sure that you're ready for compliance. One thing that I would just add to your suggestions, you can have really good systems and plans in place, and depending on the size of your staff and the other folks that are responsible for implementing some of those, sometimes you find that something that you know, is supposed to be a standard step that's being taken just isn't being done. So I do suggest that you do some sampling yourself. You know, HUD's going to be coming in, sampling files, looking to see whether the standard documentation that you've determined you need to have in each of those files is there. I would want to do a little sampling to see, are my well thought out systems, are they actually working or not, just to sort of test that. I used to, when I worked at the state level, we had a gigantic file room. I would from time to time just go in and randomly pull a file and see what was in there. And unfortunately, I oftentimes would find that there were documents that belonged in another file that were in the wrong one. So just kind of seeing, are all systems working the way they need to, and then trying to, you know, problem solve for those things in advance of the HUD monitoring might be a good thing to help you with compliance. We did not have many questions that from yesterday's session, but I wanted to just cover just a couple of these. There was a question about, are there good inspection reports, sample inspection reports, and they're referencing after the lead-based paint has been cleaned or abated. So I'm assuming from the question that what you're really asking about is, you know, before clearance is actually done, is there, for you going back to do an inspection to determine, has all of the work been completed that I specified? Does it appear that they have, you know, cleaned appropriately? Has all debris been removed? You might also be verifying, you know, did they actually follow the protocols? Have they protected occupants' belongings? All of the things that were specific to this particular project. So, I mean, the clearance testing itself is going to go through that whole scope of work and determine whether those areas are now found to be lead safe. But I guess I would suggest that you go back to using your original visual assessment log that was a, you know, went through all of the locations that you observed where you had a notation about something needed to be dealt with, and make sure then visually, based on what you saw originally, that you're seeing that corrective actions have been made. The clearance testing then is going to verify that they have cleaned appropriately, and it has now been determined by a third party that it is now safe. I don't know, Chris, anything you want to add to that one?
No, I think that's pretty good. That's pretty comprehensive. Bruce was asking maybe if you could talk a little bit about RRP and how it applies to public housing authorities.
Well, so we know that RRP, and let's see, we've got a handy dandy slide somewhere that does a side-by-side, I believe, on this. But RRP will apply, it does apply to housing, and it's applying to the contractor. So the contractor themselves is needing to follow the RRP requirement, including the disclosure that they're required to provide, which that's one of the contractor's responsibility. But we have this overlay where between RRP and the Lead Safe Housing Rule, that as we talked about, there's some differences in things like the de minimis rules, the rules about clearance, and so you're always going to be following the more restrictive of those two rules. So we mentioned in terms of prohibited work practices that we have 3 additional work practices that are not part of the RRP rule. We have more specific requirements about clearance on this. And so they're both are going to apply, but we're going to need to know the differences and follow the more restrictive of the two.
Great. Looks like a question came in. I'm trying to get to the question panel.
Let's see. I need to close my panelists to be able to see that. Close this. All right. They're saying that they've received calls from homeowners asking about free lead testing. Do we know of any grants that would help them on that? And so Karen is on the ball here and responding. So depending on where the owner is located, there may be this kind of assistance to the health department or county as part of that. And she's using the example of lead hazard control grants, may be able to provide service in that area for that. All right, so I think that handles that. There was a question yesterday about where to find the disclosure notices. And so, Chris, can we go to the end? I think you have control. Let's see, the slide where our toolkit, which I think is 102. Yeah. So if you go to the toolkit, not only do we have the different subparts as part of this, but there's also a category down closer to the bottom of hazard reduction. And so depending on the aspect of the rule that you are looking for, that's where all the related links would be for sample tools, sample reports. So I'll just notice, and I'll just mention, so for instance, there is a sample clearance report. There's a clearance report review worksheet. So it really walks you through what you, in reviewing that clearance report you received, kind of walks you through the contents of that and what you're looking for as part of that. And so all of the disclosure samples are all included in this toolkit, and this would be kind of your go-to spot for those resources.
We also have, Les, a reports video that's fairly new, and that goes through a risk assessment report, a lead inspection report, and a clearance report. So it identifies like all the required elements, what they should look like. So that's also another great resource to go to.
Yeah,
I think there was a couple more questions that have come in. Trying to get to the chat.
Question about water heater replacement. And they're calling for a lead clearance test when they take on one of these as part of the projects. And would the de minimis 2 square foot, would that allow for the test not to have to be done? And so Karen is suggesting we go back to our de minimis slide, which is going to be back here under treatment. I should be able to get you a number in just a slide number in a moment. Let's see, that's for, actually, I think, I know it was in our compare contrast between the RRP and the HUD rule.
De minimis was at the beginning, wasn't it?
I think it's in a couple spots, but yeah. Hold on, folks, just a moment. We're going to pull up that
I
slide.
found it, 22, right? Is this the one you're looking for with the de minimis levels?
Yep. So the question here is about, well, when do we actually have to do testing on this? So in the case, in being able to evaluate when you're doing any kind of work is to determine, is this, first, is it something that's not going to disturb any painted surfaces? So, depending where the water heater is located and those surrounding surfaces, it may be that you can determine, well, this is exempt because it's not disturbing any painted surfaces. But if we determine that it actually is, our work area is going to include painted surfaces that are going to be disturbed by what we are doing here, then we do also have the de minimis calculation here. So looking at, and this is going to be on a case-by-case basis, looking at the area that's going to be disturbed. If it is less than it's our 2 square foot per interior space, then we could operate under the de minimis rule and be exempt from the lead-safe work practices. They're always encouraged, obviously, to be used. So I think you really have to analyze what's involved, where this water heater that you're dealing with, and what those surrounding areas are to determine whether it's actually going to disturb paint, and then also to see then if you might be able to work under that de minimis rule. And you would want to then within your file be able to document the basis of that. So, a statement of, well, this is exempt because of not disturbing any painted surfaces. If you can include a photograph as part of that, that certainly would help. And the same sort of thing with our de minimis. You could be measuring out the area that's going to be involved and determining based on that whether it is going to fit within the de minimis rule or not.
So Les, we got a question that came in that said our property was built in 1969 to 1970, but all of the lead was removed, and we have a certification verifying this. Do we still need to comply with the lead safe housing rule?
So that's one of our, and I think, Chris, if we back up to slide 20, so one of our exemptions here is if we have a property that we are able to document as being lead-free. And so, we talked about the goal for public housing was that with modernization funds that we're going to do abatement, and in some of those cases they will be lead-free because all lead has been removed. So I used the example of the property that the lead was found to be only in the front doors. All of the front doors were removed and replaced. And so that property then can be documented as being lead-free. So in that example, we then are exempt from the lead-safe housing rule, but you need to have that documentation in place. And I think one of the themes that you're going to see here is that good record keeping that is, I worked in a system where we had record disposition processes in place. These are records that you will not want to have disappear over time. And I know when I left my state position, I had a bundle of files with some very clear labels on that I turned over to the next head of that office, and with notations that these are things you need to hold on to. So those property records, which document the risk assessment that Chris was talking about, that would be used in conjunction with your ongoing maintenance. All of the records about the work that's been done, the clearance that's been done, is going to be important to hold on to, including and especially if you have a property that has been inspected and found to be lead-free. And that could well be in a in a structure that was built in that time period. It may never have included lead, or it may have only included a few components which have been now removed, and we can document that it's lead-free. Let's see. Looks like that, at least in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's it. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to try to answer them.
There was a question yesterday about in the private market, the question about what an owner is required. Are they required to hand out the brochure on a yearly basis? So with real estate sales, we know that there is an owner's disclosure that has to be completed. So, I sometimes use the example, I sold my father's house a few years ago, and I was filling out the information about the disclosure, and in that case, verifying that we had no knowledge about that. But our lead disclosure rule does apply, and thank you, Chris, for swiftly finding that particular slide. It does apply to all pre-1978 units, both for sale or for rental units. And that's an EPA rule rather than, let's say, housing rule.
It's actually both. It's
well, yeah.
but
in this case where we don't have HUD money in this, that's
yes, that's correct.
That part's not being triggered.
Gotcha.
So,
yeah, but that's the point. It's assisted and non-assisted housing for the disclosure rule.
Yeah. So we have a rental unit, and I had to think about, I actually need to do this, and had to go online and find this and provide that to my tenant.
Yeah.
Who looked at me like, well, why are you giving me this? Chris, that's all I have in questions from yesterday.
Yeah, it was a quiet group. Don't see any new questions coming in. Our HUD staff, is there anything recent that you've seen with public housing authorities that you want us to go over again or highlight? Flora, I know you work a lot with housing authorities. I don't know if there's any areas that people struggle with a lot, or.
No, not that I can think of right now, Chris. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think we will stay on for a little bit here to see if there are any additional questions. We want to make sure you have good use of the opportunity that we have. And I think, Chris, we might just want to put up our resource list and then remind people about the EBLL training. So maybe pull up slide 101. Just remind folks about the HUD Exchange and ongoing, using these resources to find what you need. Sample forms we've talked about, posting of additional trainings. We have these great videos that have been introduced recently. And then we mentioned about the upcoming EBLL training, which is going to be on December 6th. It's for public housing and project-based assistance. And that, I believe that registration is open at this point, and that would
yes,
be
it is.
on the HUD Exchange. So we encourage folks, Chris very briefly went through that in yesterday's training, But if you are the person that might be responsible for implementing that, I think you probably need that more extended version of that coverage. Check the Q&A again.
I don't see any new questions.
Yeah. Chris, I'll leave it to you to determine how long we keep this open.
Somebody typed in exhibits, and I'm not sure what they mean by that, but there were a number of handouts that were provided for the training. We have this summary chart, which I think is invaluable. We have our definitions that you can access. These are all also found in the regulations as well as in the HUD guidelines. We have this treatments to address lead-based paint, which kind of gives you a summary of different types of work that can be done. So we talked about interim controls, what that is, how to do that, and then we have abatement, and then we have this document which is about our workers who can do what kind of work and what kind of training, and then the background information on the lead disclosure rule. So lots of information there. Just see something that might have come up in the chat. Nope, I think that was everything. Well, I guess if there's not any, oh, the orange. Where can I find monitoring exhibits that list a required documentation in a file? Well, there's the CPD monitoring exhibits, right, Les? There's I think there's one for lead, but I don't think that affects public housing because that's CPD. That notice, there was some, let me go back to the slides.
And there may be a corresponding, Chris and I are used to, with CPD-funded programs, that there are HUD monitoring checklists that they use. So it's a really good way to kind of plan, make sure you've got all the documentation in place that you need for that. I'm not familiar enough with public housing to know if there's a similar tool that the public housing folks are using for monitoring that you may be able to utilize, but I think this notice would probably be the spot to go to for this. And then I also think in our slide presentation, at the end of each of our sections, we've made a point of having a slide that talks about the documentation that you need to have in place. I think you could kind of easily pull together a checklist from that, cross-referencing it with the PIH notice.
There's a question that came in, Les. I don't know if you know the answer to it. We might need to rely on our HUD staff, asking about, is there any easy way to determine if age-restricted projects are in fact age-restricted versus head of household, to see if it meets the exemption for the lead-based paint regulations? Do you know, or should we call on one of our?
Well, it may vary a little bit with the type of funding and how they specifically document that program by program. But I mean, first I would be asking the property owner manager about the restrictions that apply to that property, and they should be able to provide you that documentation, because they would have funding agreements. They would perhaps have a restrictive covenant in place that would restrict who was eligible to occupy that property. I don't know, do our HUD folks have examples of documentation from some of the different programs that they're familiar with? I think it's going to vary a bit funding source by funding source.
One big distinction, this is Karen, that I can think of is if the property in question is an owner-occupied you know, an elderly owner-occupied unit, that is not exempt.
Yeah.
You know, again, then it comes to, usually it's going to be some sort of rental property, leased property, and there is a restriction of some sort in some fashion that restricts occupancy to one group or another, usually elderly and or disabled population.
Yeah, and I do think that's the common trip up on this is that folks look at the occupancy and think, oh, this is an elderly unit. We're not talking about who the occupants are for this exemption. It's based on that restriction for that unit. So a lot of our units that we work with, they happen to be occupied by elderly or disabled, but they may not be a restricted unit. So we need to go a bit further. You know, it's with things like the home program, low-income housing tax credit, there's a restrictive covenant that is filed for that property that would call out all of the restrictions that apply to that property and also transfer with the deed. But I think that's going to vary by that program. But the person that is responsible for renting those units, property manager, should be aware of those restrictions and should be able to point you to where that would be documented.
Great. Les, I don't have any other questions that have come in, so we can probably give folks a little bit of time left in their day.
So I think we want to thank everybody, particularly our HUD staff who have worked with us on this. I'm glad that you all have been able to participate. We hope that this has been helpful. Hold on to the handouts and the resource lists, and you know, as we mentioned, use the email that Chris has showing on the screen here if there are additional questions that come up after this session. With that, I'll say thanks, everybody. Glad you could join us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.